This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. On October 19th, 1999, 22-year-old Rebecca Hoosman finished her shift at work and was ready to go home. Due to the nature of her profession, Rebecca was an exotic dancer. Her place of employment required that each dancer be escorted to their car by one of the bouncers at the establishment. This being accomplished, Rebecca, safely in her car, headed home for the night. It was a crisp, clear evening in mid-October in the city of Lansing, Michigan, a college town that proudly claims Michigan State University. And even though October 19th was a Tuesday, it had still been a busy night at the club filled with college students drinking on fake IDs. But at least for tonight, it was done, and Rebecca would be home soon with her fiancé. They were saving to buy a house and start a family, which was the only reason she took the dancing job in the first place. But all those dreams of home and family would be destroyed in a moment. In her own driveway, as she got out of her car, Rebecca Hoosman was attacked by an unknown assailant and shot in the head. She would die at the scene, and her murderer would escape into the night. The only piece of evidence left behind was a spent shell casing from a .45 caliber handgun. Her case went cold, and her family was left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Fast forward almost 3 years later, and more than 700 miles, to Raleigh, North Carolina, May 22, 2002. The family of Stephanie Bennett, a 23-year-old graduate of Roanoke College in Virginia and recent hire at IBM in Raleigh, asked the manager of her apartment to perform a wellness check on Stephanie because she'd failed to show up for work and they were unable to get in touch with her. The manager, a short time later, found Stephanie Bennett dead on her bedroom floor. The preliminary investigation revealed that Stephanie had been sexually assaulted and strangled. And, since no forced entry was noted, they believed the assailant gained entry through a bedroom window. This was confirmed when it was discovered that the outer screen of that window had been removed and hidden in some nearby bushes. Another truly disturbing discovery was a phone, a drinking glass, and a box of tissues in the upstairs bedroom closet. Apparently, the perpetrator had gained entry hours earlier and hidden in that closet, waiting for Stephanie to get home and go to bed. That was when he attacked. Stephanie had a boyfriend, but he was ruled out almost instantly due to the simple fact that he was more than a 4-hour drive away at the time of the murder. So who was responsible? The police got to work, and what they would find would point to the unthinkable. Could a serial killer be on the loose? Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to My Hometown, Part 3. The first real break in the case of the murder of Stephanie Bennett was an email that she sent a family member a few weeks prior to her death. In this email, she detailed her growing fear that she was being stalked by a peeping Tom. Several times from her ground floor apartment, she could swear she saw movement through both her bedroom and living room windows, but she never told anyone else. A neighbor would later come forward with a description of a tall, skinny man walking a large dog that she caught peering through Stephanie's window a few weeks earlier. The police had an artist's rendering created and canvassed the area, but with no luck. Until the manager of an adjacent apartment complex said that he knew a guy who fit the description, tall and skinny, and owned a large black dog that he was always walking in the area. But he'd recently moved away. His name was Drew Planton. And I'll give you 3 guesses where Drew Planton grew up, but you'll only need one. That's right, Jefferson Township, New Jersey. Drew was the third of 4 boys in his family, and they were raised in a community called Holland Mountain. Holland Mountain was also a mountain, part of that geography that made the Milton side of Jefferson the valley that it is. So if Jefferson is a small, isolated community in the woods of North Jersey, then Holland Mountain is a small, isolated community within that small, isolated community. Back then, it consisted of only about 20 houses deep in a dense forest. The area was settled by a group of Dutch immigrants more than 200 years ago who came to the area to mine the rich iron ore deposits and set up foundries and ironworks. Drew Planton's mom ran a daycare out of their house and did her best raising 4 boys while dealing with a disintegrating marriage. Much of what we know of the history of Drew Planton and his family comes from a really stunning and intimate Reddit thread written by the youngest of the Planton brothers. In a long and at times very personal missive, the youngest Planton laid bare his and his family's burdens when it comes to all 3 of his older brothers. The oldest, at least at the time of the Reddit posts, had degenerated, along with his wife, into an unwashed hoarder, unable to keep a job due to his purposeful lack of personal hygiene. The next oldest became a convicted serial peeping Tom, whose criminal life began with boring a small hole in a wall that he realized he shared with a woman's shower in an adjoining locker room. He soon graduated to installing hidden cameras, and even after he moved away, he would return to collect the VCR tapes. He was caught after a roof leak led to the discovery of one of the cameras, and the police were able to lift a fingerprint off a small piece of masking tape that was used to cover the red blinking light that let people know the camera was recording. The third Planton was Drew, whose terrible deeds we're currently discussing. More on him in a second. But one of the most fascinating parts of the youngest Planton boy's Reddit family history is how he went from a staunch supporter of his brother's innocence to the reluctant acceptance of the proof of his criminality. More on that later. For now, let's go back to Raleigh, because when Planton's name came up, the police had very little difficulty tracking him down. However, Drew refused to voluntarily come to the station for an official interview, and he also flatly refused to offer up a DNA sample. These actions, though not criminal, definitely caused the police to take an even harder look at Planton, including their attempts to collect what's called a surreptitious DNA sample. Namely, anything someone throws away is fair game. The police can follow you after you eat a slice of pizza and throw your napkin into a public trash can. Then they can grab that napkin and run it for DNA. But Planton always seemed a step ahead. He knew the cops were onto him, and he knew what they were after. So he simply stopped throwing things away. Anything that he touched, especially to his mouth, he flushed down the toilet. The silverware he used in restaurants were taken into the public restroom and washed in the sink before he would let the busboy take them away. We know this because detectives watched him do it. They seized one of the forks he used and swabbed it anyway, but to no avail. But then investigators realized that Planton was a state employee. He worked for the government of North Carolina in the agricultural department. He tested different forms of fertilizer used in farming. And therefore, the police had the right to search his workstation, including his keyboard, his radio, and other work equipment. This time, they got all the DNA they needed, and once compared to the sample taken from the body of Stephanie Bennett, they had their man. It was a perfect match. So going back for a moment to Drew's younger brother and his journey from denial to acceptance. At first, Drew's lawyer informed the family that all the evidence collected pointed away from Drew, and that despite what the police were saying, there didn't exist a, quote, robust DNA sample for them to compare anything to. It was in fact merely a speck, nowhere near enough to be considered a legitimate sample. So, the Planton family made statements strongly in support of Drew's innocence, until they were informed of the actual truth. The lawyer had lied. He claimed he did it in service of his client to get the PR machine going in order to get the public to believe that the DNA was tainted or non-existent or basically anything to try and get his client a better deal. But all it did was further alienate Drew from his family. So back to North Carolina and the search of Planton's residence. It was there that police would make a very curious discovery. Pieces of mail addressed to a woman that no one had heard of and that no one in Drew's family had heard of. A woman with a mailing address in Lansing, Michigan. A woman named Rebecca Hoosman. A call to the Lansing Police Department started a multi-state cooperative investigation that reopened the Rebecca Hoosman cold case and promised to solve it with a simple ballistics test. Remember, the only piece of physical evidence left behind at the scene of Rebecca's murder was a spent shell casing from a .45 caliber handgun. During their search of Planton's residence, aside from the letters addressed to Rebecca, the police also found 2 .45 caliber handguns, and one of them was a perfect ballistics match to the shell casing found in Rebecca's driveway. So now they had him for 2 murders in 2 separate states with 2 very different MOs. If it weren't for the mountain of physical evidence linking him to both crimes, it's likely that Drew Planton would have gotten away with the murder of Rebecca Hoosman. But the story doesn't end there. In January of 2006, while awaiting trial and with the full knowledge that he was about to be charged with the Hoosman murder, Drew Planton, though ordered to be on continuous suicide watch by the prison psychiatrist, still he was somehow able to secure a plastic bag, and he was also able to remove the elastic strip from his fitted bedsheet. These items were used to simultaneously suffocate and strangle himself to death in his cell. In the years that followed, mostly due to the writings of the youngest brother, we learned that it's highly likely that Drew Planton had additional victims. In one instance, Drew's mother found a blood-soaked mattress in the trunk of his Mustang. She notified Lansing police, but they never showed up to process the mattress, and so she threw it out. Also, Drew's younger brother, the writer, received several of Drew's personal belongings after his suicide, including an unopened Xbox video game system. Being a gamer himself, he opened it and was surprised to find that A, the police hadn't looked inside of it. Sure, it still looked like it was sealed from the factory, but wouldn't the police look inside everything before they shipped things off to next of kin? And B, there were several pieces of mail in that Xbox box addressed to random women, family pictures of unknown women, even a few license plates from various Midwestern states. The younger brother did what he was supposed to do and turned all these items over to the Lansing Police Department, but they were refused unceremoniously. It hasn't been and probably never will be determined if Drew Planton indeed had more victims. So earlier this year, while I was researching season 3 of The Devil Within, which chronicles the 13-month killing spree of the son of Sam in New York in the late 70s, it was then that I interviewed a 25-year veteran of the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit, a man named Ken Lanning. Later in his career, Ken was assigned to the division that investigated satanic ritual abuse, which is why I was eager to speak with him. But when you have a guy like Ken on the phone, it's really tough not to ask him about a million other things, like serial killers. After all, that's what the Behavioral Science Unit was created for. How do we effectively profile a serial killer so we're able to understand them and, first and foremost, get them off the streets, but also to maybe be able to spot some signs that could predict future behavior? Ken is a great interview, and while I was researching this episode, I remembered something that he told me that completely changed my focus for these episodes about my hometown of Jefferson Township, New Jersey, my beloved J-Town. What suddenly jumped into my head was the reclassification that occurred within the FBI several years ago regarding what constitutes a serial killer. Based on their studies, for a murderer to be classified as a serial killer, the requisite number of victims was reduced from 3 or more to 2 or more. I was sitting here thinking that having 3 murderers from J-Town was crazy, as that put my little town at 3 times the national average. The 3 killers being Tommy Sullivan, Colin Abbott, and Drew Planton. But think about it. Tommy killed himself and his mother. Colin killed his father and his stepmother. And Drew Planton killed Stephanie Bennett and, according to Michigan police, Rebecca Hoosman. That makes them all serial killers. Whereas the likelihood of a murderer is roughly 1 in 20,000, the likelihood of a serial killer is 1 in 7 million. That puts Jefferson not at more than 3 times the national average, but at more than 3,000 times the national average. Yeah, Gen Xers from Jefferson Township, New Jersey are 3,000 times more likely to become a serial killer than, as far as we can tell, anywhere else in America. There's no place like home. Thanks for listening. Please make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and now you can hear full episodes on YouTube, including our entire back catalog. So, until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.